Shalom and marhaba, and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, an independent journalist and policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We have a very special episode this week with Saudi analyst Aziz Alghashian back on the podcast. Aziz is, among other things, the Director of Research and Senior Fellow at the ORF Middle East think tank, and is an expert on Saudi foreign policy, especially as it relates to Israel. This was a terrific conversation about the prospects, or not, of Israel-Saudi normalization, how the past 16 months have looked from Riyadh and the Gulf, the Trump effect on, well, everything, and how Benjamin Netanyahu has been misleading the Israeli public about Saudi Arabia. Fascinating stuff, and vitally important to hear this perspective, as Saudi Arabia looms over a possible conclusion to the Gaza war, any post-war order, and even, dare we say, renewed Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. Let's get to Aziz. Hi, Aziz. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Neri. It's good to join you, my friend. Thank you very much for having me. It's really good to be back with you.
It's really good that you are back. I'm really delighted that we were able to do this. I know you have a busy day today, and it's also been nice to hear and see you right before we started recording. It's been a while.
Yes.
But last time you were on was way back in August of 2023. It was a different world and a very different Middle East back then, as we'll get into in just a moment. But Aziz, I wanted to start here with your general thoughts and observations. Really, how have the past 16 months looked from Riyadh in terms of, obviously, the October 7th attack, the devastating war in Gaza, Hezbollah being wiped out, direct Israel-Iran strikes, and all the rest of it? And you remember this, but I'll remind our listeners, last time you were on, I said this very clearly, we usually get a very heavily Israeli or American or, in some cases, British or European perspective on all these very important issues and stories, and not just on this podcast, but it's really important to get the view from the Arab world as well. So what has it been like over the past year plus?
Well, thank you, Neri, because I just really appreciate the fact that you're, giving me an opportunity to share, my thoughts and, to have voices from the region or about the region from the region. And this really speaks to you guys and speaks to you. So thank you very much for this. A great deal of times we, the Saudi perspective or the Saudi understanding towards Israel and Saudi understanding generally is based on what others say about Saudi and not what Saudis themselves say about Saudi. And therefore this is a real grand opportunity. So I appreciate this, my friend. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
As our mutual friend Shira Efron likes to say, Saudi-splaining. We get a lot of that.
Yes,
both
indeed.
in Israel and the United States.
Yeah, exactly. She's spot on. And the past 16 months have been unsurprisingly devastating, and it really has its toll on the region, and also I think a very difficult time in Saudi as well. Saudi, of course, I don't want to say embroiled, but Saudi is really occupied by reconstruction of its economy, trying to kind of elevate its position and try to restructure its own economy, which is a mammoth task. But it really can't separate that from the regional dynamics and what has taken place. So, this is something that's been a very difficult time for us all. And I think as a Saudi, so I spent a great deal of time outside of Saudi, but I remember being in Saudi as a child during the second Intifada. And the atmosphere that I experienced last year and the past 16 months have been so similar to that. I mean, I remember last year going through this and I'm like, man, this reminds me very much of that time, late 2000. So 23 years later, the fact that they felt like there was a nightmare unfolding in the background. That's what it felt like. And I have to say, I think even following a great deal of the dehumanizing rhetoric that has been coming out of this topic, not on all sides, but about all peoples, the efforts of trying to dehumanize all the casualties and the innocent people that have lost their lives, it just reminded me of a very important question of, are we ready for more normalization? This is the first question that I asked myself, if I'm honest with you. I think, is the region ready for more of this sort of what Netanyahu called the peace for peace paradigm? And it just, for me, leading up to the war, and I've said this before in other places, leading up to the war, peace and normalization have never been so far apart. And it was really devastating to see this. And so the environment has changed. The perception of both Israel and to Palestine and the Palestinian situation has changed.
So that's really, really interesting. And we're going to delve into the issue specifically of normalization in, trust me, in just a second. And we should say, Aziz, in your own work, you really try to kind of build bridges and try to cultivate better understandings amongst all sides, amongst all parties. And that's to your credit, especially during very difficult moments like obviously the past year.
Yeah.
I'm curious, in terms of both culturally and geostrategically, what has it been like in Saudi watching everything unfold in Israel and Gaza, and by the way, not just Israel and Gaza, so Lebanon? Are Saudis talking about the war? Have they talked about the war? Are they kind of watching it unfold in, I don't want to say hour by hour, but kind of on a daily basis?
Yes, it's very difficult to have it removed from the TV screens and from the headlines. The war is in itself a constant backdrop. And what even makes it there is the fact that I think because us Saudis in the past few years, we've kind of grown in agency and grown in confidence. And the fact that we have kind of imbued upon ourselves that we are no longer just a regional player, we're trying to be a global player. And the fact that we're trying to be a global player necessitates a more proactive, or I would say a larger presence. And so I think from that point of view, we were always involved in the war. And I think it's very hard not to. I mean, because I think the war has shown how big the Saudi borders are, and therefore how exposed we are also. So one thing that I actually wrote in the Israel Policy Forum, and I think the series of Critical Neighbors, that was published, I think, 3 days before the war. I think it was published October 4th, where I wrote, I remember sharing this and saying that there is a problem that if this war, if the Palestinian-Israeli situation explodes, there will be regional spillover. But I didn't expect, I think none of us expected it to be to this magnitude.
No one did. No one did.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say no one did. But I mean, when you see the Houthis are getting hostile on the Saudi borders, this really brings out a lot of anxiety. When you have the exchanges between Iran and Israel, this is tremendously anxious. All these different kinds of hotspots now was something that I remember. I don't want to say I'm Nostradamus here, but I was very worried about. And another thing that I was very worried about, which is probably more frightening, is really the domestic aspects of some of these spheres that, I think there's a great deal of anxiety over terrorism and lone wolves. And this is something that I think made us all very frightened, I would say, because it's a situation it just resonated very, very deeply. And I appreciate the fact that you say that I tried to build bridges. I could say you are a fellow bridge builder. And therefore it was, we had to navigate, I think, this discursive landscape, I would say, and this rhetorical landscape. And it was hard trying to find, it wasn't hard to find these building bridges, but one had to ask whether or not it was the right kind of timing. But then we came to the conclusion, all of us, that we had to say, well, there is no such thing as a good time to write these things. We have to start really talking about the root causes, and we have to, if it's a problem that we all share, that means it's a problem we have to work together on. So from the Saudi point of view, and by the way, just on a more official note, if one looks at the Saudi language and the Saudi statements, even before October 7th, they were warning of this. And so, they were warning of that, this situation is explosive. It's a very explosive situation. This situation is explosive. And this is perhaps where the change has happened, where I think, in my opinion, that the Saudi ruling elite and the Saudi, I think, foreign ministry, but in particular, generally the Saudi ruling elite, the perception of the Israeli-Palestinian lack of peace was a theoretical concern. But I think October 7th and especially the subsequent events and the geopolitical ramifications transformed it from a theoretical concern to an actual concern. And therefore, this is now a regional security issue that the Saudis are seeing. And that was one of the significant changes that took place in the Saudi perception of this war and this conflict itself.
That's really interesting, and it's a good transition into, well, Israel-Saudi normalization itself. I would say it's obviously back in the news in a big way, but it probably never left. I think even last year, in the depths of very high-intensity Gaza war, the Biden administration was still pushing for this, as we both know. And as we both know, when you came on last time in late summer 2023, a deal was actually believed to be quite close. Now, in terms of what has changed, you laid out really in the wake of October 7th and everything that happened afterwards, a major shift from what you said theoretical to a very real, tangible, and immediate security and geopolitical concern. And you also wrote a very interesting op-ed that was translated into Hebrew in Haaretz, the Haaretz Daily here, titled, "Dear Israelis, your government is misleading you." And basically, I'll quote, I really like this. You basically said, or wrote, Netanyahu talks about normalization without understanding the discourse taking place among the Saudis themselves. We have presented our position clearly time and time again, but it seems that certain elements choose to ignore it for political reasons. Therefore, I ask you, please listen to us, the Saudis.
Yes.
So what would you like the Israeli public to hear from you Saudis about the prospects of normalization?
Well, I just want to say just a few words on the nature of Saudi-Israeli relations from my point of view and from my vantage point, and in my kind of conclusion. The Saudi-Israeli official relation, the over-the-table kind of prospects of normalization, et cetera, is something that is incredibly exogenous and not intrinsic. And what I mean by that is that it is very much dependent on external factors that dictate the likelihood of official relations or the other way around. So historically, in the mid-90s, early 90s, Saudis have, for example, reduced their Arab boycott officially from removing the secondary and tertiary levels. And this was against the backdrop of the Oslo Accords. So basically, official relations is always dependent on other aspects. And in this case, when it comes to Saudi-Israeli normalization, the Saudi calculus is dependent on two things. Firstly, the American aspect, which is a new dimension that has come in Saudi-Israeli relations. And this is a result from the Abraham Accords, which is kind of gave the blueprint of saying, well, if you want us to really normalize relations with Israel, then there's something that the United States has to offer. And what the United States has to offer is something very large in itself. But the second one and the most pertinent one is, of course, that there has to be a very irreversible Palestinian component, a credible one. Now, this is discussed whether or not the extent of what is an irreversible step and what is not an irreversible step, but it has to be tangible. And the reason being is because the Saudis themselves, as a result of the war and a result of the immense amount of exposure that the Saudis have had towards the war, their understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli dynamics and also the understanding of the dynamics of the occupation, moreover, the management and this management of the conflict process that Netanyahu strikes of weakening the moderates and emboldening the extremists is something that the Saudis have developed now. They're aware of this situation, which
they're wise to the situation.
Yes, they are aware. And so now it's becoming, you can't basically slip something to the Saudis. You can't really dress something up and say, hey, here's a credible irreversible step. We're understanding what credible irreversible steps should entail. So this has changed. And let me also say what is not going to be a motivator for Saudi-Israeli normalization, which I write in the op-ed, which is the Iranian aspect, the threat of Iran. And this is something that I think time and again, many people have assumed or believed that this triangulation of threat of Saudi, Iran, and Israel is what's going to push for normalization. And I'm trying to make the argument that that is not the case. If there's any kind of normalization, it actually happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It didn't happen between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that is due to the Saudi way of approaching their security concerns with Iran. This doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory with Iran. There's still a great deal of mistrust, but the framing of this relationship from being an existential threat to a threat that could be managed and discussed within diplomatic spheres is something that I think the Saudis are strategically invested in. But what that doesn't mean is going to be normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so I wanted to communicate that and say that it is not enough to just use the threat of Iran as the kind of the prerequisite of normalization of Saudi. There is no other way other than going through the Palestinians. You cannot go around it. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. The Palestinian issue is something that has to be addressed. And this is what I tried to communicate. And not just that. I mean, I didn't want to wag my finger at all, and I hope I didn't come across that. But what I wanted to say is basically that we agree, we have a lot in common. And also that I have heard a lot of negative stereotypes about Israel and Israelis. And it wasn't till I spoke with Israelis themselves that these things were dispelled and these myths were gone. And you get to see a genuine relationship with not only partners of peace, but brothers and sisters of peace. And I really mean that, and I don't want to sound cliche, but that when people say they're brothers of arms and et cetera, there's genuine brothers and sisters of peace. And this is very crucial. And also just another thing is that I'm seeing in this kind of discourse that it's very unhealthy that sometimes they're celebrating either some of these funny characters that go on Israeli TV that wear Saudi clothes or funny clothes, some kind of semi-Gulf kind of clothes based somewhere in the Gulf. And they're like, well, here's someone that looks Saudi and kind of sounds Saudi or sounds Gulfy. And he's saying horrible things on Palestinians or about Arabs or praising Netanyahu. And I'm just saying, listen, please don't believe that. We gotta engage in a more serious discussion. And that is precisely why I'm very thankful for you and others to have this platform and to discuss and to say, listen, let's engage more and expand upon this.
Right. Let's have a real conversation about the reality of a potential deal and not pretend like the Palestinian component of it or even the threat of Iran will be enough to get a deal over the line, no matter what certain Israeli officials or TV news programs would like us to believe. And by the way, Aziz, in terms of not wanting to wag your finger at this Israeli government or any Israeli government, don't worry. You published an op-ed in Haaretz, so by Haaretz standards, you came off pretty tame.
I was mild.
Worry.
I was mild.
Yeah, you were mild relative to what you can sometimes find in Haaretz, which is a newspaper that we all know very well and love very much, especially certain reporters and writers that we know. And let me press you a little bit. So in terms of kind of the brass tacks of a deal, and by the way, we're going to talk about other components of it, especially the U.S. side. But when you and other Saudis talk about credible, irreversible steps towards, I assume, Palestinian statehood, what do you imagine that needs to entail? And obviously, I'm not going to hold you to these negotiating positions. We're just two guys with microphones talking. I'm just curious what that would actually look like from your point of view.
This is a very important question. And this is one of the things that hasn't changed before October 7th, which is basically who gets to say what is credible enough and what is good enough. And this is basically going to be a result of Saudi, Palestinian, and Arab-Palestinian negotiations. So with the Saudi position has always been when they were asked and when we were oppressed of saying, what is your position? Then what would you want to see? The immediate response is it's not up to us to dictate what is good enough, what is enough. It is a result that you have. It is a discussion that you have with the Palestinians. And you see, therefore, that hasn't changed. The ball is back into the court of this trilateral dynamic of Palestine, Israel, and the United States. Now, what I'm trying to say, and one of the things that I'm trying to argue is that I think this process ought to be regionalized. And I think it's gradually becoming regionalized of what is considered a credible, irreversible step, et cetera, because it is tied to Saudi-Israeli normalization. And this then is a discussion between the Saudis and Palestinians themselves of what is good enough. What the Saudis need is also a Palestinian thumbs up of saying, yep, I think this is good enough. And therefore this means that this is another layer or a process of negotiation in itself. And so one of the things that I've called for and wrote is that in these Palestinian irreversible steps should be facilitatory steps that bring about not only, should have a post-normalization aspect where it helps not only integration, of course, Israel is more kind of has the economy to be robust, but something that could help the Palestinians integrate into the region themselves, which could help kind of build the pathway to the two-state solution even more and strengthen it. So I think, in my opinion, this is, I hope I answered your question, which is basically, it's going to be a result of Palestinian, Saudi, and Arab and Saudi discussions of what is considered irreversible and credible.
I think that's a fair and diplomatic answer.
Yeah.
And in terms of the Palestinian-Saudi dynamic, we know that at least the Emiratis have, and by the way, also the Biden administration, very much pushing for reform inside the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
Is that something as well that the Saudi government, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, will also be pushing for? That the Palestinians will also need to get their house in order?
Yes. This is clear, and I think this is a universal thing, in my opinion. I think it's a and without being cavalier here, but it's something that's clear. Why? Because this is something that's very important. The Saudis are never saying they're not willing to help. The Saudis need confidence in their support, and that's why. And we're now looking at a Saudi that's very different fiscally, and very different with their financial support. They are becoming very, very prudent because, as I mentioned earlier, they are heavily involved in the restructuring of their own economy, which is Vision 2030. It's for Saudi Arabia, this is an existential question of how can we change this economy from a oil-centric one to a diversified one that's not oil dependent or not as much to be oil dependent. So therefore, giving money and giving funds is in itself requires a new process. But this is where I think, in my opinion, here are opportunities where I think not only the economy and the theme of diversification, but I think this is now an opportunity to diversify not just Saudi, but Arab support to the Palestinians by helping, diversifying the support through integration, through integrating their economies, through integrating the institutions, and also supporting not only Palestinian ventures, but joint Palestinian-Israeli ventures. This is one mechanism I think that could be expanded upon. And then that could be a vehicle of integrating or regionalizing the two-state solution process. Of course, this is from a theoretical point of view. And, I think it requires a lot of, obviously, a lot of the mechanisms and the details. But I think this is one way that, this difficulty of the fact that we're not going to be easily giving money any longer is in itself probably much better. And they will need to see, confidence in where the money is going to go. But also, this is an opportunity to help build jointly the processes required to maximize the input that comes into the support.
To make it sustainable and hopefully long-lasting.
Yeah, and credible and robust. That we could expand upon. And this is something that can then, as by the way, the late Martin Indyk said, we these things could be treated as anchors. We could anchor it and then kind of make sure we could build upon it. I remember he said that.
Yes, our dear late friend, the ambassador Martin Indyk. Good shout out to a great man. Nice Aziz. We'll be right back after this brief message.
At this pivotal moment that could mark the beginning of the end of the war, Israel Policy Forum experts are providing timely, trustworthy analysis. Against the backdrop of the ceasefire in Gaza and President Donald Trump's return to the White House, Israel Policy Forum has published our recommendations for the new administration and Congress, aiming to stabilize areas of conflict while creating a foundation for new diplomatic and political horizons. These recommendations address 4 key areas important to the US, Israel, and regional partners: security assistance, West Bank stability, Gaza, and regional security and integration. A link to this resource can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the support the show link in the show notes.
On that issue of especially Saudi support, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that there's still, we're in the second week of a ceasefire in terms of the Gaza war. It's unclear whether we'll get to a second stage of the deal after this initial 6-week first stage that will actually lead to a permanent end to the war.
Yeah.
I guess I have 2 questions. Number one, this may go without saying, but I'll ask it anyway. Is a precondition of anything the fact that this Gaza war needs to end?
Yeah.
Number one. And number 2, let's assume that the Gaza war does end. What role, if any, do you envision Saudi Arabia playing in the quote-unquote day after in Gaza, whether politically or whether economically via post-war reconstruction? How do you think that aspect of the overall grand bargain should be handled and will be handled?
See, this is an important question because there's a lot of speculation about the Saudi willingness and eagerness of just kind of rolling in, sending their forces in, and all of a sudden they're going to just bankroll all this reconstruction efforts. And this is again,
they're just going to solve Israel's problem for it.
Exactly. And not only that, but just pass the baton straight to Arab forces. And there you go. It's yours now. Take over. We have Operation Success. This is what he wants. And Netanyahu or total victory is achieved now. And I'm afraid it's a bit more complicated. And not only that, this also is not going to come for free. And therefore, I think the post-war reconstruction efforts lends itself to leverage that the Arabs now can use in itself. So this is what's interesting, because that was something that I think was missing over the years, that became less and less and less. And this is now something that has kind of changed the dynamics of leverage that we have. And I think we made it clear time and again, and even the UAE have made it clear time and again that any kind of reconstruction efforts or participation requires a pathway to a 2-state solution. It has to be encompassed within a framework of a 2-state solution. Now, this is kind of the overarching aspect. The practicalities of this is another thing. The fiscal aspect we talked about, that Saudis, notwithstanding their economic reconstruction and their prudence, their fiscal prudence, are still willing to play a role financially, but they cannot participate in any reconstruction when the conditions may lead to the destruction of what they're reconstructing again in 2 years' time. So therefore, there needs to be a root cause or a solution that addresses the root of this issue. And even when they welcomed the ceasefire that came, this is what they mentioned in the statement, that we hope that this is now a beginning of a process that addresses the root cause of the conflict in itself. So that's from the financial part. The second part that they're going to play is that, will they have security services and will they operate in a security aspect and in some way? Now, they haven't denied it, but of course they haven't eager to do this, because I think this particular role is very difficult. The reason being is that, Saudi's a big country and it doesn't have many people in it. The security services in itself is, I think the only time they took part in any kind of official theater or operation was perhaps in Bahrain in 2011, Operation Gulf Shield. And that was due to the invitation of the Bahraini monarchy. But that was also something that was manageable. The situation in Gaza is a different one.
And by the way, Aziz, the war against the Houthis in Yemen.
And they participated, and they were at the outskirts. They participated. You're right. That's a good one. And the one with the Houthis. This is all, this is all overstretching the ability and the capacity to participate. Therefore, if I was to say what kind of role would they play, it will be in a supplementary role. It will be in something that they could help with logistics. It could be something that they could help with, facilitating things, as opposed to a real deep security coordination of the Palestinian security forces there. And why not? But I just don't see it. And the reason being is because I think if there is any kind of skirmishes that take place between Hamas or other kind of lone wolves, and any Arab forces get caught up on that, this is going to be a very, very difficult political situation, if I'm honest with you, and one that does not lend itself to a healthy role. You know what I'm saying? So
right.
I think it has the potential to complicate things, but that's why it's best to be on this kind of supplementary role.
Agreed. And this is why the Gaza problem set, as the diplomats and analysts call it, is so difficult because even if you end the war, Israel has made it clear that it will, as Netanyahu and others have said, will retain overall security control over the Strip and will retain the right to intervene if Hamas or any other militant terrorist groups make any kind of, militant moves.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so difficult, because even if you, quote unquote, end the war, what happens on the day after?
Exactly.
Not easy. And I've been on record on this podcast and other places saying, you talked about leverage that the Arab states, including Saudi, have over Israel in terms of post-war Gaza. I think Netanyahu and those close to him also think they have some leverage that they can use to end the war in return for a Saudi deal, or to use it as part of a Saudi deal. So in other words, they will kind of end the crisis as a partial payment in return for normalization.
Yeah.
And I've said that before here, so it's not anything new.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was President Herzog that alluded to this last year, if I'm not mistaken. I think around January, I remember it crossed on some of the feeds that I had, but I wasn't really sure. I couldn't find it again, so I wonder. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but he said that basically, I think maybe the only time we could finish the war is that if the Saudis won't normalize relations. And I've heard it from other people as well, who said to me in a discreet environment where they said, okay, the only time we're gonna finish the war is that if Netanyahu stops, unless Saudi Arabia normalizes. And that's very wishful thinking.
It turned out to be wishful thinking last year when the Biden administration officials explicitly put it on the table in terms of a carrot for Israel to accept a ceasefire and then to use that as a launching point for a larger regional deal. By the way, back then also including Lebanon and Hezbollah. And I think the Trump people have the same idea, that they want to use agreement by Israel and this Netanyahu government for the second stage, for a permanent end to the war, as a launch point for Saudi normalization.
Well, it's going to be part of the sequence. And I think what the war has added is that it added a layer of conditions. And one of these conditions is to stop the war. That's the first condition. And that's, I think, probably the dynamic of last year. Because I think everything last year was, everything was tied together. There was basically the two-state solution or Palestinian statehood promise, whatever that would have been, that they had to stop the war. And I think the Saudis tried to use this carrot last year to try to stop, incentivize some sort of deal, deal and say, listen, you got to stop this. And let me just point two gestures that the Saudis made to say, listen, you could stop this war and we could get normalization, but you got to stop this war first, and then enter into, let's negotiate something within a framework of a two-state solution. And that was in two things. There was a joint Saudi Norwegian gathering that was around April. I think it was the end of April or beginning of April. Yes, beginning of April, where they said, if the war stops, then the Saudis are ready to have diplomatic relations with all countries in the region. Look, all countries in the region. This is a diplomatic reference to Israel. And this is when Saudis really mean business. They were ready to say, okay, this is, just try to stop the war. And they tried to do this. The second one was in May last year, which was basically that the Saudi American part of the normalization of this grand bargain deal is ready. We agreed on what the Saudi American component will be in this defense treaty. Now it was a sign basically from Saudi to say, listen, we're ready, stop the war, do give promises and tangible kind of aspects within the framework of a two-state solution. That was in itself incredibly difficult, and then normalization could take place. And this was coming just before the cycle of the election cycle began. And it didn't materialize. So now, once that cycle kind of finished, I think the dynamics of what the Saudis really want is something different now. I think that the Saudi requirements are elevated a bit. And hence why we see a stronger language coming from the Saudi ruling elite and more proactive statements about the requirement of credible, irreversible steps towards peace.
That's a very interesting and very important point that both the language and I suppose the official position, they go hand in hand, obviously, of Riyadh is that the price may have gone up since last year.
Yeah.
Aziz, I got to ask, the new U.S. president, Donald J. Trump, had some, let's call it inflammatory comments this past Saturday to the effect that he wanted to maybe clean out, quote unquote, that's his quote, Gaza, and move 1.5 million Palestinians to either Egypt, Jordan, maybe other Arab states, as he put it, either temporarily or long term, and during which I suppose the strip will be rebuilt. How did these comments go over in the Arab world? I can tell you that in terms of the international media, they went over quite badly. I know I say that from personal experience. How did it look from your vantage point?
Yeah, it was clear. Firstly, I think when it comes to Jordan and Egypt, they had to respond, and they responded in an unequivocal way. But they also realized they were dealing with Trump, and they're dealing with a particular temperament that they do not want to be at the end of. And so they made sure that this was to be completely unentertained. That's the first one. When it comes to even the Saudi media really had a field day about this, especially Al Arabiya, which basically said, which they were very much not just disagreeing with this, but they were saying how inflammatory this was. Mm-hmm. And this is what I anticipate the Saudi kinds of ways and how they're going to deal with such comments made by the president. At the end of the day, he is the president of the United States, where everybody has a strategic interest in having. So they're going to have to be this management of the relationship and the management of this temperament. So I assume the following. I assume the fact that maybe if there are official responses, that the response will be in a unequivocal yet measured tone officially, while others will do the heavy lifting of the sharp tone, the unofficial officials or the unofficial kind of spokesman, if you like, that will then say, okay, and the messages will say that this is basically preposterous. And this, to be honest, it speaks to a larger issue of Trump-Saudi relations. And I think there's this perception that perhaps this, for me, this bromance that many people are depicting this relationship as, or the fact that, Saudis are just going to be willing to yield to whatever Trump says requires a lot of attention, because that's not going to be the case. A lot of the times people look at the sword dance that happened in Saudi. Saudis really try to invest in Trump. But in fact, half of his time was disappointing when it comes to Saudi-American relations. So he was someone that was actually not very, he said some not very flattering things. But most importantly, he was someone that when Saudi was attacked by Iran, most likely, in 2019, he didn't react. He said, well, if the Saudis want us to protect them, they better pay. Right. And so the Saudis knew that, this is someone who's not going to, with us, he's going to want to have his cake, and he wants to eat it as well. And we're not going to be, pushed around by this. So we're going to be more, I would say, not susceptible to any of these whims. We're going to have to hold our ground more and maybe be ready for a little jostle, a smiley jostle, a friendly jostle, a managed jostle. But we're just not going to be pushed around because there is the perception in DC that, hey, we'll just say the Saudis and the Saudis will do whatever they want, whatever we want. So, and this comes to the Palestinian issue too, that we're going to just tell them to normalize and they're going to normalize. And the Saudis will remind them, they'll say, listen, you're a transactional person, aren't you? Therefore, these are the transactions that you have to make to do this. So I think it's an opportunity for them to even boost their agency, which, by the way, whenever the Saudis have a strong position vis-a-vis the US, it only boosts Saudi morality and nationalism even more. And you could see that even when Biden visited in 2022, the fist bump, if you remember.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he came in, and it was basically, if you probably remember that there was the backdrop of potentially normalization, and maybe there was an anti-air defense alliance. And then he came back, and then he left with no anti-air defense alliance. He left with, there was the gateway, the airspace was open. This is important, that has to be mentioned. But there wasn't any normalization or any anti-air defense alliance. And it boosted the Saudi agency. It boosted the Saudi nationalism more. The fact that we did not yield to American pressure. And I think this is what Trump will bring into, the Trump administration is going to be an opportunity for. And just one final thing quickly, a lot of people in Saudi and a lot of the Saudi discourse, the public and the social discourse, I would say, were not overly welcoming of Trump, but they were kind of more happy to see Biden go away, who was someone that kind of promised Saudi to be a pariah, et cetera, et cetera. So these things need not be conflated, that there's going to be an over-accommodation of Trump. And so we're just going to have to prepare for some of these statements. And I wouldn't be, of course, there will be Saudi responses. Just how are these responses going to be uttered? It's something we're going to have to we're all going to be kept busy, I would say.
Well, us and the entire world will have to manage this one individual sitting in the White House.
Yes.
And like you said, firm but diplomatic.
Yeah. And another thing is that the region, we can no longer be reactive to the whims of anybody any longer. We need to collectively be proactive. We need to be proactive here, and we need to start working together. So this is why I'm very happy for this opportunity to really begin to discuss and talk about what we want out of relations from each other, rather than someone else going to jolt a reaction out of us, and we're going to work around that. So this is an opportunity for regional and particularly Arab-Israeli agency in itself to guide the discussion of where we want relations to be and what we want from each other.
I think that's a fair point. I think it also very much depends which Israeli government you're dealing with, whether the current one or whether there will be a different one in the near or longer term. It's a huge question on this and literally every other issue.
Yeah.
Aziz, final question to you. In terms of the Trump effect and the U.S.-Saudi component of any normalization deal, as you mentioned, and I think this is very much accurate from everything I've heard, the U.S.-Saudi aspect and all the details have actually been agreed, right? And that it was really that kind of the Israeli-Palestinian component that had to still require a lot more work, to put it mildly. Yeah. But from your understanding, in terms of the details of what Saudi is still asking of Washington and still requires of Washington, even under this new U.S. administration and this new U.S. Congress in particular, is it still a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty? Is it still a civilian nuclear program? What other aspects should we look for if this deal actually gets off the ground?
This is an important question, and I think this even evolved as the discussions evolved as well. So it was a defense treaty at first, and it wasn't exclusively a defense treaty. It was nuclear cooperation, which is, I think, perhaps the most sensitive out of all this American package, the Saudi American package, or this part of the Saudi American package, part of this overall Saudi-Israeli normalization. So there's the nuclear cooperation. There's also going to be an AI aspect, which is clear from the discussions, and also an economic component as well. So it's going to be a strategic, broad treaty, or a treaty that encompasses these different aspects. Why? Because I think a defense treaty in itself, while it offers certainly benefits, but there are some limitations to it as well. And I think that the world is seeing now that even NATO, if you ask them with the Article 5, they seem very anxious as well. So therefore, the Saudis, I think, really want something that's more broad rather than kind of depth in terms of the Saudi American security component. So that's one aspect that I would say. The second aspect is, while the administrations agreed, or close to agreeing, they for all intents and purposes, they agreed. The question remained whether it will be passed or not.
In Congress.
In the Senate, in Congress, in the Senate. This is the question. I mean, this still was not tested. And therefore, for me, I think, and someone you know the landscape far more than I do, it really is a question now of whether can Donald Trump help get those 76 votes that is required to ratify any kind of treaty. And the Saudis won't settle for anything less from the United States. The Saudis won't settle for anything less. It's a difficult task, I think.
It's a huge question. And the notion during the Biden presidency was always that it was easier to get that treaty under a Democratic president because Democratic president had already a built-in overwhelming support amongst Democrats, and the Republicans would also sign up for various reasons, not least having to do with Israel-Saudi normalization. Now it's the reverse. You have a Republican president, obviously, deeply unpopular amongst Democrats, but you still need those Democratic votes.
Yes.
And you have to square that circle. You have to whip, in congressional terms, whip up support. And I think that's also another reason for a significant Palestinian component to it, to get the more liberal or center-left votes in the Democratic Party on side.
Absolutely. And this is why I say, personally, there's no point in talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization without really having any tangible, getting the numbers there. There's just no point talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization if that political landscape in the Senate in Washington, D.C. is not, and there's no progress there.
That's yes, to put it mildly. And the idea that, okay, the Israelis may not be willing to play ball, Netanyahu will choose his own domestic considerations over even a prize like a Saudi peace deal, effectively. There's no chance of the U.S. and Saudi moving ahead without Israel or without the Palestinians.
No, there isn't. I mean, there isn't. I mean, everyone is talking about what the Saudis can accept and what the Saudis, and it just goes back again. I mean, what I just said recently, it cannot be separated from the Palestinian issue. It just cannot. You know, these things are two cornerstones to Saudi-Israeli normalization. And you have someone who chose, to quote Amir Tibon, choosing annexation over normalization. And then Trump seems to be supporting deportation over normalization. So this is clearly, everything is geared towards the complete opposite conditions of what is required for normalization with Saudi.
I assume you mean deportation from Gaza and not deportation
of Gaza
from the U.S. to Colombia or every other place.
Yeah. Well, right. I wouldn't be surprised if you want to send all Arabs to Mexico as well. I'm not sure if this is something we could he'll come up with, but exactly. This is what I meant by not just people from Gaza to Egypt, but people from the West Bank to Jordan. So it's funny.
It's a very well, look, to put it mildly, because we understand these issues and we deal with it professionally, each one of these not little, but major aspects are so complex. And then you have the most powerful man in the world giving off the cuff sound bites to journalists on Air Force One. And then everyone tries to run around understanding what he actually meant by it. Yeah. If anything. Aziz, we'll have 4 years to figure it all out. Don't you worry. But for now, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much once again for coming on and sharing your insights. Hugely important to hear from you and from someone with this expertise from the Gulf.
Thank you so much, Neri. It's a real pleasure to join you, my friend. And I look forward to joining you guys again. I just really appreciate your work and what you guys stand for, and I just really appreciate this, my friend. Thank you.
The feeling is mutual, and I'll be seeing you in person soon, and we'll leave it at that.
Alrighty.
Okay, thanks again to Aziz Alghashian for his generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening.